Right now, on tens of millions of gaming PCs around the world, something is quietly happening that Microsoft has not addressed in a single blog post, a single keynote, a single tweet, not one word. And if that silence doesn't strike you as strange yet, it will by the end of this video, because inside Steam, the platform where most PC gamers on Earth actually spend their time, Linux usage just did something nobody predicted. It jumped from a sleepy 2% a couple of years ago to over 5% at its peak this year, more than doubling in 12 months. While Windows quietly bled market share for the first time in decades. And it's not just gaming. Globally, across the entire desktop computing world, Windows just slipped below 60% market share for the first time in years, a genuinely historic milestone that barely made a ripple in mainstream tech coverage, and Microsoft has said absolutely nothing about any of it. By the time this video ends, you'll understand exactly why this happened this year and not any other year, and why the silence coming out of Redmond might be the loudest part of this entire story. The trigger has an exact date stamped on it, October 2025, the day Microsoft officially ended support for Windows 10. Hundreds of millions of PCs had stayed comfortably on Windows 10 for years, largely because Windows 11 demanded something most people had never heard of, a security chip called TPM 2.0, instantly locking out an enormous population of older but perfectly capable machines from ever legally upgrading. When support finally ended, those users hit a real fork in the road. Buy new hardware just to keep getting security updates, pay for Microsoft's extended support program, or look somewhere else entirely. Steam's own hardware survey captured that moment almost in real time. In the single month after Windows 10's end of life, the share of Windows 10 holdouts on Steam collapsed by nearly 15%. Most of those users landed on Windows 11 exactly as Microsoft expected. But a meaningful slice did something Microsoft clearly did not see coming at this scale. They walked straight past Windows 11 and installed Linux instead, pushing it to an all-time Steam high of over 5%, a number that would have sounded like fiction just 3 years earlier. It's worth understanding just how controversial that TPM 2.0 requirement was the moment Microsoft first announced it, because the backlash back then was already a warning sign pointing straight at this outcome. TPM stands for Trusted Platform Module, a small dedicated security chip that manages encryption keys and helps defend against certain firmware-level attacks. A defensible idea on paper, but in practice, it meant millions of computers built only a few years before. Windows 11 launched, machines still perfectly capable of running modern games without a hitch, were suddenly told they were permanently ineligible for the very upgrade meant to keep them secure. Enthusiast communities scrambled almost immediately, building unofficial workaround tools with names like Rufus and Flyby11 that could force Windows 11 onto unsupported hardware by bypassing the check entirely, and plenty of users took that route rather than buying new machines or abandoning Windows outright. But bypassing an official requirement comes with its own quiet risk, the very real possibility of losing access to official updates somewhere down the line. And for a huge population of users who either never heard of those tools or simply didn't want to gamble their system's stability on an unofficial patch, Linux was suddenly the more straightforward answer, sitting right there the entire time. Here's what makes this moment fundamentally different from every failed Linux gaming push over the last 2 decades. The old excuse finally disappeared. For years, the honest, simple answer to why nobody serious about PC gaming touched Linux was that most games just didn't run on it. Full stop, no argument needed. Valve quietly dismantled that excuse through a compatibility layer called Proton, first released back in 2018, which translates the Windows-specific code most PC games are built on into instructions Linux can actually run, acting as an invisible interpreter, standing between a Windows game and a Linux machine, so developers never have to build a separate Linux version at all. Proton's compatibility numbers climbed steadily and dramatically since that first release, and today, the overwhelming majority of the most played titles on Steam run through it with performance that, in plenty of documented cases, matches or slightly beats native Windows performance on identical hardware. A genuinely remarkable engineering achievement built through years of unglamorous work almost no player ever noticed happening underneath them. The Steam Deck, Valve's handheld gaming computer built on a Linux-based operating system called SteamOS, became an unintentional multi-year advertisement for all of that invisible engineering, proving to millions of ordinary gamers who had never opened a Linux terminal in their lives that Linux gaming wasn't some intimidating command line ordeal anymore. It was just gaming with a controller that happened to boot into something other than Windows. And Valve hasn't slowed down this year either, announcing a revived Steam Machine Console concept it first tried and abandoned back in 2013, now returning with far more capable modern hardware and, crucially, years of Proton maturity that simply didn't exist during that original failed attempt, alongside a new handheld called the Steam Frame, both running SteamOS rather than Windows. That matters enormously beyond two product announcements because it means Valve isn't passively benefiting from people fleeing Windows 10. It's actively building an entire hardware ecosystem specifically designed to give people a reason to choose Linux gaming on purpose, rather than stumbling into it only because their old PC got locked out of an upgrade. Every new SteamOS device Valve ships expands the install base developers have to consider when weighing whether Linux support is worth the engineering effort, which in turn makes Linux more attractive to the next wave of switchers, a self-reinforcing cycle that simply never existed back when Linux gaming was a niche interest confined to a small, dedicated community. There's a quieter economic layer to all this too, one that rarely gets mentioned alongside the headline numbers. A huge share of the Windows 10 machines locked out by the TPM 2.0 requirement weren't old or underpowered by any reasonable measure. They were perfectly capable computers, built just a few years too early to include a chip most owners had never even heard of until it suddenly decided whether their PC could keep receiving security updates. For a lot of those users, spending several $100s on new hardware just to run an operating system that looks and feels nearly identical to the one they already had felt like an unnecessary expense, especially with a genuinely capable, completely free alternative sitting right there. Linux distributions built specifically for approachability, names like Linux Mint, Bazzite, and CachyOS, have spent the last few years smoothing over nearly every rough edge that used to scare mainstream users away with graphical installers, automatic driver detection, and app stores that look and function almost identically to what people already expect from a modern operating system, meaning the jump from Windows 10 to Linux stopped requiring any real technical expertise. Right at the exact moment, millions of people were forced to make a decision about their aging hardware. Bazzite, in particular, has marketed itself directly at exactly this audience, positioning itself as a Steam Deck-like gaming experience for any PC or handheld, packaging years of Linux gaming progress into a product aimed squarely at Windows refugees rather than existing Linux enthusiasts. And this is exactly where Microsoft's silence starts looking less like indifference and more like a company that genuinely doesn't have a good answer yet. Windows 11 adoption has kept climbing on Steam since the Windows 10 cutoff, which on the surface looks like a win for Microsoft, but the more revealing number sits underneath that headline figure because Linux held onto its gains in a way that used to be completely unheard of. Historically, Linux's Steam share would spike briefly around a Steam Deck launch or a major Proton update, and then quietly slide back down within a few months, a pattern so consistent that most analysts had come to treat it as a permanent ceiling rather than a temporary plateau. This time, even after the initial post-Windows 10 surge cooled from its 5% peak into the high 3% range, that number stayed dramatically higher than anything Linux had ever achieved on the platform before. Exactly the kind of retention data that turns a temporary spike into a genuine structural shift. The global stat counter numbers make this look even less like a Steam-specific quirk, because Windows dipping below 60% worldwide isn't driven by gamers alone. It reflects businesses, schools, and everyday households running the exact same calculation gamers were running. Is it genuinely worth replacing working hardware just to keep running Microsoft's operating system? None of this means Windows is in any real danger of losing its dominant position soon, and it would be dishonest to pretend. Otherwise, Windows still commands roughly 90% of Steam's user base and a similarly commanding lead across the broader desktop market. But dominance and momentum are different things, and momentum is exactly what has quietly shifted away from Microsoft this year for the first time in a long time. A company that controls the operating system underneath nearly every business computer, school computer, and gaming PC on Earth doesn't need to panic over a 5% shift, but it should probably be talking about it. Instead, there's been total silence, and in an industry where companies typically respond loudly to far smaller threats to their turf, that silence itself has become the story worth watching. There's a defensible business reason for it, too. Windows hasn't been Microsoft's primary growth engine for years. That role now belongs to Azure and its enterprise AI products, so a 5% Steam shift barely registers against the company's overall revenue picture, and publicly acknowledging Linux gaming's momentum would only hand Valve and the wider Linux community exactly the kind of mainstream legitimacy that momentum feeds on. Game developers, meanwhile, have reacted to this shift far faster than Microsoft has, which only makes the silence more conspicuous by comparison. A growing number of major studios have started officially certifying Steam Deck and Linux compatibility at launch, rather than patching it in months later, and several publishers have quietly updated their anti-cheat systems to support Proton, closing one of the last remaining gaps that used to make Linux a non-starter for competitive multiplayer gamers. That shift matters more than it sounds, because competitive online titles have historically been the hardest category for Linux to crack. precisely the genres where anti-cheat vendors were most nervous about kernel-level exploits. And watching several of them quietly reverse course this year is one of the clearest signals yet that the industry sees this Linux surge as durable rather than a passing blip tied only to Windows 10's shutdown. It's worth remembering just how many times this exact prediction has failed before, because that history is precisely why so many longtime observers have been slow to take this surge seriously. Nearly every year for the last 2 decades has produced some version of the headline, "The Year of the Linux Desktop," usually tied to a product launch or a controversial Windows update, and almost every single one of those predictions quietly fizzled within a year or two. Ubuntu's mid-2000s rise generated real excitement before plateauing well short of mainstream adoption. Chromebooks brought a Linux-based OS into millions of schools in the 2010s, but carved out their own separate category rather than ever threatening Windows on gaming or productivity hardware. Even the original Steam Machine initiative back in 2013, the same concept Valve is now reviving, launched with enormous fanfare and collapsed within a couple of years thanks to weak hardware, confusing marketing, and a compatibility layer nowhere near mature enough at the time. Understanding that graveyard of failed predictions is exactly what makes this current data so notable, because for the first time, the retention numbers aren't following the old boom and bust pattern. And the specific combination driving this one, a hard operating system deadline, a genuinely mature compatibility layer, and competitive hardware from Valve, has simply never existed together before. Valve's own incentives matter here too, and they're worth sitting with for a moment, because unlike Microsoft, Valve has a direct financial reason to want this Linux surge to succeed, rather than simply benefit from it as a bystander. Valve doesn't sell operating systems. It makes its money almost entirely through Steam's marketplace, taking a cut of game sales regardless of what OS those games run on, which means Valve is one of the very few major companies in the PC industry with zero financial stake in keeping customers locked into Windows. If anything, reducing dependence on Microsoft's platform serves Valve's long-term interests directly, since Microsoft runs its own competing storefront through Xbox and has occasionally signaled ambitions to build deeper store integration directly into Windows itself, a scenario that would put Valve's entire business model at risk if its customer base stayed permanently dependent on an operating system controlled by a company with its own competing commercial interests. Every dollar Valve has poured into Proton, into subsidizing the Steam Deck's aggressive pricing, and now into the Steam Machine and Steam Frame, can reasonably be read as a long-term hedge against exactly that kind of platform risk, buying genuine independence from Microsoft's infrastructure regardless of how far Linux's market share ultimately climbs. There's also a quieter institutional dimension helping explain why the global numbers are moving in step with the Steam numbers rather than staying flat while only gamers switch. European governments and public institutions have run long, slow migrations away from Windows for years, citing licensing savings, and a desire to reduce dependence on a single foreign vendor for critical infrastructure. And Windows 10's end of life created a natural forcing function that accelerated several of those migrations. Simultaneously this year, since institutions facing the exact same hardware replacement decision as individual consumers had the exact same financial incentive to seriously evaluate the alternative instead of automatically renewing their relationship with Microsoft. Step back and look at how unusual it actually is for a single external deadline, Microsoft's own decision about when to stop supporting an old product, to end up entirely different company's platform, because that dynamic sits at the heart of this entire story. Microsoft didn't lose Linux gaming's newest converts to a brilliant marketing campaign or a superior competing product. It lost them largely as a side effect of its own hardware policy, a decision that prioritized a specific security architecture over backward compatibility with a massive installed base of slightly older but still perfectly capable machines sitting in homes around the world. That's a genuinely unusual way for a technology giant to cede ground to a competitor, not through being outcompeted, but through a self-inflicted hardware requirement that quietly pushed a meaningful slice of its own customer base toward evaluating alternatives for the first time in years. Whether Microsoft eventually loosens hardware requirements for the next major Windows transition, or simply accepts a permanently larger Linux presence as the new normal, the decision it makes next will say a great deal about how seriously the company actually views this shift internally, no matter how little it has said publicly so far. Keep an eye on a few specific signals over the next year to see whether this trend keeps building or fades the way past Linux gaming moments always eventually did. Now watch whether Linux's Steam share stabilizes well above its old 2% baseline. Watch how Valve's Steam Machine and Steam Frame actually sell once they hit shelves. Watch whether more competitive multiplayer publishers follow the anti-cheat vendors who've already extended Proton support. And watch whether Microsoft ever actually breaks its silence. Because the moment Redmond starts publicly addressing Linux gaming by name, rather than letting the numbers speak for themselves without comment, is the moment you'll know this shift finally became too big for even the world's biggest software company to keep ignoring.